The official start of America's involvement in the Vietnam War can vary depending on what source is used. The Department of Labor uses the date of August 5th, 1964, while the U.S. Congress and the Veterans Administration uses the date of February 28th, 1961. Some say it should be even earlier. The website Gale.com documents when the first American military personnel were sent to Vietnam under the Military Assistance Advisory Group program, MAG for short. President Harry Truman had approved National Security Council, that's NSC, Memorandum 64, in March of 1950, proclaiming that French Indochina, that's present-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, was a key area that could not be allowed to fall to the communists, and that the U.S. would provide support against communist aggression in the area. That's basically the Truman Doctrine. Now, in September of 1950, U.S. President Harry Truman sent MAG to Vietnam to assist the French in the First Indochina War. The President claimed they were not sent as combat troops, but to supervise the use of $10 million worth of U.S. military equipment to support the French in their effort to fight the Viet Minh forces. Now, by 1953, the aid increased to $350 million to replace the old military equipment owned by the French. Some things just don't change, I guess. Moving on, America's involvement in Vietnam goes back even further to September 1950. America's involvement in Vietnam began in the waning days of World War II with the Office of Strategic Service, also known as the O.S.S. They were the predecessors to the CIA. The O.S.S. came into being by a presidential military order issued on June 13, 1942 by President Roosevelt. Now, the O.S.S. was to collect and analyze strategic information required by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and to conduct special operations not assigned to other agencies. During World War II, the O.S.S. operated all over the world, gathering intelligence as well as training indigenous people in the art of guerrilla warfare tactics, such as blowing up enemy installations and blowing up people. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Military Portal released a report in 2004 on the First Indochina War, 47-54, and it states, Indochina, colonization by the French began in 1859, at first starting with the indirect rule and gradually transitioning to direct rule. By 1940, the French Governor-General had supreme power over French Indochina. As with all European colonial powers, the French used Indochina for exporting raw materials back to France while sending finished goods back to their colonies for sale. All was going well for the French until 1940. On the surface, the JCS report stated by 1940 there were some 40,000 Europeans in the region. Nationalist movements had been developing in Indochina during the 20s. One movement, led by a man called Nguyen Na Quoc, who had traveled to the Soviet Union and studied Marxist doctrine, would eventually come to the forefront of the Vietnamese independence movement. Now, the world would know him as Ho Chi Minh and his followers as the Viet Minh. In June of 1940, Germany defeated the French army in Europe. French General Philippe Pétain surrendered his country to the Nazis. A puppet government was set up under Pétain called Vichy France, and under the terms of the surrender, Vichy was out of the war and had to remain neutral. A large part of France was to be occupied by the Nazis, with a smaller portion of the country to remain unoccupied. France was allowed to maintain its overseas colonies. Now, the French colonial powers in Indochina were now under the control of Vichy France. Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tri-Party Pact, also known as the Berlin Pact, on the 27th of September 1940. Germany and Japan were now allied in their war aims. Japan could move into French Indochina without France making any objections, because Germany would not allow it. In September of 1940, Japanese troops occupied the northern section of Indochina. This was to stop China from receiving arms and fuel through the French Indochina along the Kunming-Haiphong Railway from the Indochinese port of Haiphong. The Vichy government reached an agreement with the Japanese whereby 40,000 Japanese troops would be stationed in the northern part of French Indochina. Now this all changed in July of 1941. Japan needed to occupy the rest of Indochina in preparation for their invasion of the oil-producing Dutch East Indies. However, French troops and the civil administration were allowed to remain, albeit under Japanese supervision, as long as they controlled the local Vietnamese and maintained the colonies as a supply base for the Japanese army fighting in China. Now, the Vichy French colonial powers remained neutral. However, a small group called GBT, Gordon, Bennett, and Tan, set up an amateur intelligence network to feed intelligence to the Chinese, British, Free French, and, after Pearl Harbor, the Americans. This group was responsible for reporting on Japanese troop movements, weather reports, and any information that would be helpful to the Allied war effort. Also, between 43 and 45, Force 136, British SOE, Special Operations Executive, would drop Free French operatives into northern French Indochina to help organize local French colonial resistance forces as well. However, with the Allied invasion of France in 1944, the situation in Indochina changed. Japan suspected that the French authorities might assist Allied operations in the region. Plans were drawn up to depose the French authorities in the region. The article, titled "Three Amateur Spies and the Intelligence Organization They Created in Occupied World War II Indochina" by Bob Bergen. This was published in Study in Intelligence, Volume 63, Number 1, March 2019, and that's located on the CIA's website. States, on March 9, 1945, the Japanese initiated Operation Migo, their contingency plan to take over Vietnam. Japanese troops took possession of the French administrative officers, the radio stations, the central telephone, and the telegraph office, banks, and the main industrial enterprises. They also attacked the police forces and arrested French civilians and military authorities. Now, the intelligence flow from Indochina they had become to depend on was gone. The Allies' air attacks had to cease because no weather reports came through or reports on Japanese movements. Into this intelligence vacuum stepped Ho Chi Minh. The website historynet.com tells how the O.S.S. and Ho Chi Minh began working together. In March of 1945, Viet Minh guerrillas rescued a U.S. pilot who had been shot down in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh himself escorted the pilot back to the American forces in Kunming, where the 14th Air Force was based. Now, rejecting an offer of a monetary reward, Ho asked only for the honor of meeting Major General Claire Chennault, founder of China's legendary American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, and now commander of the 14th Air Force. During the meeting on March 29th, Chennault thanked Ho, who, after promising to help any other downed American pilots, requested only an autographed photo of the general. Ho would later show that picture to other nationalists, Vietnamese factions, as proof of his warm relation and implied support from the Americans. Pretty smart. Now, at this time, few knew that Ho, whose real name was Nguyen Na Qua, was a longtime communist who had been trained in the Soviet Union. The O.S.S. decided to capitalize on their new friend, Ho Chi Minh, by training Ho's Viet Minh followers in guerrilla warfare. After the Japanese occupation in March of 45, the O.S.S. sent in a team to help organize Vietnamese resistance. The website Vietnam50th.com states, in July of 1945, a 7-man team from the U.S. Office of Strategic Service, that's the O.S.S. Special Operations Force section, parachuted from a C-47 transport plane into the tiny village of Kim Lung in a remote mountainous part of northwest Indochina. Ironically, 20 years later, This area would become known as Thud Ridge through a generation of F-105 Thunder Chief pilots during Operation Rolling Thunder. Now, the O.S.S. team was codenamed Deer Team. The men were led by Major Allison K. Thomas. Deer Team's mission was to work with local Vietnamese guerrillas to disrupt or destroy the communications, logistics, weapons, and supply of the occupying Japanese military forces. The team was composed of Allison L. Thomas, commanding officer, Rene D. Fourneau, second in command, enlisted personnel Henry Prunier, Paul Hoagland, Lawrence Volk, Sergeant Zielinski, radio operator, and Aaron Squires. Now, the Americans were welcomed wholeheartedly. Ho had his men create a large banner saying, "Welcome to our American friends." Now, they saw the Americans as their saviors from their French colonial masters. An interesting side note to Deer Team's first meeting with Ho was the fact that Ho was extremely ill, drifting in and out of a coma. He was not expected to live. An article titled "The O.S.S. Role in Ho Chi Minh's Rise to Political Power" in the CIA Studies in Intelligence, Volume 62, Number 2, June 2018, Bob Bergen wrote, "Lieutenant de Fourneau, the team's French-American member, found him in the corner of a smoky hut, covered with what appeared to be rags. Yellow skin stretched over his skeletal body. He was shaking like a leaf. Obviously, with a high fever, O.S.S. medic Paul Hoagland took a quick look and stated, 'This man doesn't have long for this world.' Hoagland, who was a trained nurse, examined Ho and speculated he was suffering from malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, or a combination of all three. He gave him quinine, sulfa drugs, and any other medicine he had, and checked on him periodically. Within 10 days, Ho seemed to have recovered. He was up walking around his own camp. Deer Team set up their training base and went to work. They trained approximately 40 to 50 Vietnamese guerrilla fighters in the use of small arms and guerrilla tactics. The training was in its infancy, though. Sergeant Zielinski, the team's radio operator, picked up a broadcast on August 15, 1945, declaring that the war was over. The O.S.S. mission now changed to finding missing American servicemen who were held as POWs, as well as disarming the Japanese military in French Indochina and repatriating them back to Japan. The O.S.S. sent in 2 teams to handle this new mission, one in the north of Indochina, which is present-day Vietnam, obviously, and one in South Vietnam. Now, the goodwill established by the O.S.S. with Ho Chi Minh was at its height. At this time, the local Vietnamese saw Americans as their friends and potential partners in gaining Vietnamese independence. The problem was, French Indochina was part of the China-Burma-India Theater of Operations, or the CBI for short. Supreme Allied Commander of the CBI was Lord Louis Mountbatten, Royal Navy. On top of that, France was considered an ally during the war, even though the country surrendered to the Nazis in 1940, and Pétain, or the Pétain government, collaborated with the Nazis. Notwithstanding that small issue, the French wanted the Allies to help in reestablishing control over their colony. Now, when the Japanese surrendered, the only force in the CBI willing to help France maintain her colonies were the British. The Americans didn't want France to reestablish its colonial rule over Vietnam at first, so the United States stayed on the sidelines, so to speak. In the northern part of Vietnam, the Chinese army under General Liu Han was planning to take supreme control down to the 16th parallel until the Japanese were disarmed and repatriated back to Japan. They didn't care that Ho was going to declare independence. Seeing this power vacuum, Ho Chi Minh moved quickly to establish control over all of Vietnam and declared independence on September 2nd, 1945. Now, Ho being smart, he incorporated portions of the U.S. Declaration of Independence into his speech. I mean, how could the U.S. then turn against people who believed in its own founding principles and philosophy? Makes sense. Well, the British occupation troops did not arrive in Saigon until September 13th, May 1945, because MacArthur wanted to have center stage for the surrender of the Japanese on September 2nd on the U.S.S. Missouri. So anyways, Major Douglas Gracie, commander of the 20th Infantry Division, arrived in Vietnam to accept the surrender of the Japanese troops. Now, it is at this point that things start to go south. Gracie did not have enough troops to stop the Viet Minh from exercising control over southern Vietnam, so he rearmed Japanese soldiers and the French colonial army that had been imprisoned by the Japanese earlier that spring. The local Vietnamese began resisting the British and the French control. It was in this Alice in Wonderland Twilight War that the United States sent in O.S.S. teams to gather intelligence and recover American personnel. The O.S.S. teams, which were sent into Indochina to recover missing American POWs, were stuck in the middle of a colonial power struggle. France was determined to reestablish full control over their Indochina colony, but had to rely on the British to neutralize the Viet Minh until they could deploy their own troops in the colony. Now in the north, Ho had established control, like I said, and the Chinese didn't care about it, while in the south, the British under Major General Gracie and his ad hoc army were able to push the Viet Minh out of Saigon and reassert control up to the 16th parallel. Now, the U.S. troops on the ground had no clear idea of what their mission was beyond, again, representing American interest, collecting intelligence, and the repatriation of American POWs. The head of the O.S.S. team in Saigon was Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey. Now, Dewey's an interesting character. He was the son of a congressman. He graduated from Yale University in 1939. He went to France to report on the war for the Chicago Daily News. And in May of 1940, during the Battle of France, Dewey decided to enlist as a lieutenant in the Polish Military Ambulance Corps with the Polish Army in exile fighting in France. Following the defeat of the French, Dewey escaped through Spain to Portugal, where he was interned for a short period of time. Now, Dewey eventually found his way into the O.S.S. In August of 1944, Dewey parachuted into southern France, leading a 10-man Jedburgh team. They operated behind enemy lines for 6 weeks. He transmitted intelligence reports on German troop movements back to the Allied headquarters in London. Now, the article, The O.S.S. in Vietnam, 1945, A War of Missed Opportunities, by Dixie Bartholomew Fees, published on the website nationalworldwar2museum.org, states, on September 4th, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey arrived in Saigon. Dewey's team, while working with the Viet Minh, arranged the repatriation of 4,549 Allied POWs, including 240 Americans, from 2 Japanese camps near Saigon. Dewey was royally treated by the Viet Minh, and he met often with them in his quest to gather information. The Viet Minh believed the Americans would support their push for freedom. The amicable relationship Dewey established with the Viet Minh would not last very long, though. The Pentagon Papers, Part 1, Vietnam, the U.S., 1940-1945, states, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam ruled as the only civil government in all of Vietnam for a period of 20 days. On September 23, 1945, with the knowledge of the British commander in Saigon, French forces overthrew the local DRV government and declared French authority restored in Cochin, China. Guerrilla war began around Saigon. Contemporary news reports state on September 25, 1945, the local Vietnamese in Saigon began to riot over the British and French reasserting colonial control over Saigon. On September 27, 1945, edition of the Wilmington Morning Star ran the story of the riots. The Annamites, that is what the local Vietnamese were called at that time, burned Saigon's marketplace last night and seized control of the Saigon slaughterhouse. This left the city meatless, and it was believed that much of the fresh foodstuff was destroyed in the marketplace fire. The article went on to say American Army air personnel were helping guard hotels where the European civilians crowded for overnight protection. Now, to quell the riots, Major General Gracie used some very brutal tactics. This is where Colonel Dewey ran afoul of Gracie. Dewey did try to intercede on the Viet Minh's behalf. He did complain to General Gracie about the treatment of the local Vietnamese. Now, a lieutenant colonel does not question the orders of a major general, especially if that major general is representing another allied country. Dewey's impertinence, along with his insistence on flying an American flag on his Jeep for safety reasons, which General Gracie told him was against regulations, earned him a quick exit out of Vietnam by order of General Gracie. Now, the situation in Vietnam had deteriorated rapidly. It got to the point that if an American did not clearly identify himself as an American, he was in danger of being ambushed and killed. Hence Dewey's reason for wanting to fly an American flag on his Jeep. Well, after his dust-up with General Gracie, Dewey was recalled quickly from Saigon. He was scheduled to leave Vietnam on September 26, 1945. Wednesday morning, September 26, Captain Herbert Bluchel driving the Jeep and Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey headed for Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Dewey's flight was due in from Bangkok at around 12 noon. Now, Bluchel related in an interview for WGBH-TV, see the link below, what happened on that day. We dropped his luggage off at the airport, then Peter suddenly discovered that he'd forgotten his dog tags and they're in his room at the Continental Hotel. So we went back and picked up the dog tags, and while we were at the hotel, we were informed that O.S.S. Captain Coolidge had been badly injured. He'd gone up country with a small contingent of British to bring some French families out of the village of Dal Lat. They had been ambushed while there, and during the fighting, he'd had his throat cut. So we rushed to the British Field Hospital to see how he was and how he was doing, and that he was in good hands. But he was pretty badly injured. Now, Peter was mad as hell about that. To think that would happen to one of us. So we stayed with Coolidge a little bit, then went back to the airport and got there about noon. The plane still hadn't arrived. Now, Lieutenant Rhodes said he still hadn't heard from the plane, but he was sure it would arrive sometime. Peter said, okay, when it gets here, just hold it. We're going to go back to our headquarters for lunch. Now, I'd been driving Peter all morning, so we got into the Jeep, and he said, Blue, I'll drive. I said, that's all right, Peter, I'd like to drive back. And he said, oh no, I want to drive. I said, okay, fine. I really didn't want him to drive because, frankly, he was kind of a lousy driver. So we took off, and instead of the main road back to Saigon, he took a back road which was a little shorter to our headquarters. But it was out in the wilds, and a little bit I said to Peter, why are you taking this road? And he responded, well, save some time. I said, it could be a little dangerous. Peter's response was, oh well, nothing's going to happen. Now, as we're approaching headquarters, if you turn a corner to take the road leading to our headquarters, basically it parallels to the headquarters actually, we encountered a roadblock consisting of some logs and some brush. And in order to get through the roadblock, we had to make a sort of an inverted S. Now, all this time we're driving, Peter was talking about Captain Coolidge and how unhappy he was that he'd been hurt so badly. As we went through the roadblock, we noticed 3 Annamites standing in the ditch to our left. Now, Peter was still angry about what happened to Coolidge. He shook his fist at him and yelled something in French. What he yelled, I don't know because I don't speak French. Well, right after that, we were just on the spade edge of the S-turn heading for the ditch, and a machine gun opened up on us. The burst caught Peter in the back of the head on the left side. The Jeep continued and tipped on its side. I grabbed a hold of Peter, but he was dead. The machine gun burst hit him exclusively. It didn't hit me at all. And there weren't even any bullet holes through the windshield, so he caught the full burst. Well, the ditch was about 4 or 5 feet deep, and next to the ditch on the other side, it had a hedge. And the hedge was about 3 feet thick, maybe 6 to 8 feet high. Firing continued, rifle fire, machine gun fire, but luckily the chassis of the Jeep protected me. I had a .45 in my holster, and I had 3 clips, basically a total of 21 rounds of ammunition. Peter had a carbine, .30 caliber carbine, in the Jeep. I grabbed that, it jammed right away. I don't think that thing had been fired for months and months and months. So I had to get out of there and went back to the Jeep again and checked on Peter. There was nothing I could do for him. So I made my way around the hedge. Now the other side of the hedge, there's a golf course. So the hedge protected me, basically, and I made my way down to the edge. Now people came around the end of the hedge and started firing at me. There were about 15 or 20 of them. There's firing coming through the hedge as well. But I slowed them down with the .45. Till I got to the edge, there was no more protection for me, and they were still coming. I had 2 rounds left, so I took off across the golf course. I had to run about roughly 500 yards to our headquarters, and they started firing everything they had at me. They shot off my hat, bullets went through the trousers. They didn't hit me, just lucky. So I arrived at headquarters, and Captain Frank and White were there, and he had 2 war correspondents guests for lunch, plus Sergeant Wicks was there. Now we broke out our arms, and we had a pitched battle for about an hour or so. Turns out Peter Dewey was the first American to be killed in Vietnam. After the firefight ended, Captain White and his O.S.S. men went back to the ambush site to recover Dewey's body. But by the time they returned, the Viet Minh had removed the body and stolen the Jeep. Dewey's body was never recovered. When Ho Chi Minh found out about Dewey's death, he ordered a search for the body. He also sent a letter of condolence to President Truman, expressing deep regret over the unfortunate incident. The O.S.S. personnel in Vietnam at that time expressed a belief that the U.S. should not become involved militarily in Vietnam. Now, in his interview when he got back to the States, Captain Buchel stated, "When I got back to Washington, I informed them that it was my opinion that in no way should we become involved in a land war in Southeast Asia. In Indochina, the terrain being too difficult for one thing, and the fact that we would be restricted to operating below the 16th parallel. It would be a guerrilla war situation, and I just couldn't see any way we could win." And I was quite vehement about it, but nobody listened. No one in Washington paid any attention to Buchel's omniscient predictions about America becoming engaged in Vietnam. Dewey was a casualty of World War II, as Studs Terkel called it in his book, The Good War. But he was the first casualty in what would eventually become a guerrilla war, a war fought by the sons and daughters of World War II vets, a war that would tear the country apart. Both Buchel and Dewey saw the handwriting on the wall for Vietnam and America. The last report Dewey sent back to Washington contained the following line: "Cochin China is burning. The French and the British are being destroyed there, and we are forced to get out of Southeast Asia." His name is not on the Vietnam Memorial with the 58,220 other casualties, because the Vietnam War would not start officially until the early 60s. Well, I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please hit the like button, ring the bell, and subscribe to my channel. And most importantly, please share this video with your friends who might find this interesting. Thank you.